Okay, my 2 minutes are up. So hello, everyone, on and offline. I think the offliners are the lucky ones because they are in Geneva and they're watching the lake and they are at the Broche Foundation and they can socialize. We, unfortunately, including myself, couldn't make it, but I think technology nowadays can make up for this, although not fully, of course. I also want to welcome in particular those who are far away in New Zealand and Australia, for whom it is quite late in the evening, and I appreciate the effort they're making to address us and express their views on this very important issue, which is the child's right to identity in assisted reproductive technology. This is actually our second seminar since the creation of CHIP earlier this year. And I would like to say that this is basically part of our advocacy efforts to unpack identity rights in family relations as reflected in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. There are international standards which are providing safeguards for the creation, modification, and preservation of a child's identity. But nonetheless, millions of children are deprived of this basic right. The majority of the children have not been registered at all at birth or have no proof of that. And for others, birth records have been falsified or lack data on biological filiation. Such situations are rampant across the world when children are abandoned, transferred unduly into care of others, trafficked, separated from parents in emergencies relating to natural disasters or civil or political unrest, but also in the context of artificial reproductive technology. Art. The current effort by the United Nations Legal Identity Task Force and also by others place emphasis on birth registration and nationality, but focus less on safeguarding the child's origins, scene, and family relations. And yet, identity plays a crucial role in the life of every child, as also reflected in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Without identity, children invariably face problems accessing basic rights such as maintenance of family ties, health, development, and social services, and are on the whole more vulnerable. We in CHIP refer to identity as a gateway to the enjoyment of other basic human rights. The identity and family relations of a child cannot be for sale. When information about identity is incomplete or generated by illicit elements and falsified or are missing essential biodata amounting to sale of children, problems of a medical and psychosocial nature are likely to compound children's sense of commodification and may have impact for a lifetime. The area we will be covering today is of great importance, where legislation and societal views struggle to keep up with advance of medical science, both nationally and internationally. Failure to do so can create a legal vacuum in which children's rights are compromised. Whenever there's a moral or ethical societal debate involving multiple stakeholders, we must accept that views may differ, even amongst those who consider best interest as a primary or the paramount consideration. Our purpose should be to understand which questions children born through these different methods are confronted with, and how we can assist them in addressing them in compliance with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Our aim is to have constructive discussions on how to preserve and restore the child's right to identity. We have a great list of speakers, and I will not introduce every single speaker to you to save time. The CVs are on the website. But I'm going to make an exception for the first speaker. I cannot prevent myself from saying a few words about Professor Israël Nisand, who is the leading authority in France and beyond on bioethics, and we are honored with his presence. Combining his pragmatic experience as an obstetrician, having practiced art with that of an academic, embracing a philosophical approach on human reproductive matters, make his contribution exceptionally valuable. And I really would like to welcome you, Professor Nisand, and start with a question. Can you tell us how societal views on parentage in the context of art have evolved, how that is reflected in law, and how it affects children born through these methods? You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Est-ce que je peux partager mon écran? Yes.
Oui, oui, vous pouvez.
Merci. Est-ce que c'est OK pour vous?
Oui, je pense que vous pouvez agrandir l'image en évitant le... Ouais, voilà, c'est ça. Et maintenant, le bouger un peu à droite, voilà.
It's OK?
Oui, vous avez la parole.
Merci de ces mots très élogieux, Maude, que je ne mérite pas.
Si, si.
La survenue de l'aide médicale à la procréation a ajouté un degré de difficulté supplémentaire à l'identité de l'enfant. On savait depuis très longtemps qu'il existe aussi une filiation masculine, en plus de la filiation maternelle. La filiation maternelle tombait sous le sens. C'était facile. En revanche, ce n'était pas très facile de dire qu'un homme qui avait eu un rapport sexuel quelques mois plus tôt avec une femme en était le père. Et la compréhension de la filiation paternelle a fait passer l'humanité du stade de horde au stade de famille. La famille, c'est quand un père reconnaît des enfants comme étant les siens. Et depuis les confins de la préhistoire, rien n'avait changé sur le sujet de l'origine. L'homme était le fruit d'une rencontre, avec une rencontre sexuelle dans l'amour ou dans la contrainte, mais une rencontre bien réelle, même si le père n'était plus là. Même si la mère ne savait pas en dire grand-chose, il y avait bien eu un père quelque part qui un jour avait étreint sa mère. Par amour, par nécessité, en douceur ou en rapt, avec ou sans consentement. Et l'humanité était restée sur ce socle stable du récit de l'origine de chaque humain, jusqu'à ce que survienne l'aide médicale à la procréation, qui est capable de pervertir cette loi très ancienne. Désormais, des gamètes peuvent provenir de personnes totalement différentes que celles que l'on reconnaît comme parents. Désormais, l'origine peut être faussée par la technique, tronquée par l'état civil et cachée par les parents. Ceux qui vivent cet effacement nous disent depuis peu qu'ils éprouvent du vertige, voire même du malaise. Voilà ma réponse, Maud, à ta première question.
Oui. Je voudrais vous inviter de continuer. Je ne vous poserai plus de questions parce que je pense que ce que vous venez de dire appelle d'autres commentaires que vous avez sûrement envisagés. Allez-y.
Et donc, désormais, l'origine biologique est différente, ce qui s'illustre par un recours inouï au biologique. On n'aurait jamais pensé à l'ADN pour délimiter une famille, ni à déterrer Yves Montand pour savoir s'il ne serait pas le père d'une héritière potentielle. Le biologique comme vérité ultime, un avatar de plus de notre modernité qui n'hésite pas à profaner. Des associations se plaignent de la procréation médicalement anonyme et demande quelle est la légitimité qui se cache derrière l'interdit qu'il aurait fait de connaître leur origine. Quelle est la raison qui explique que notre société ait fait de tels montages juridiques pour maintenir, coûte que coûte, certaines apparences liées à l'origine des enfants? La levée de l'anonymat sur les futurs dons qui a eu lieu dans de nombreux pays autour de nous cherchait à promouvoir une valeur fondamentale des droits de l'homme, le droit de toute personne de ne pas être privée de l'accès aux informations qui la concernent et tout particulièrement aux informations qui concernent ses origines. Ceci ne se réduit pas à enlever des caches sur des noms. Il s'agit en réalité d'un vrai changement social et culturel. Loin de biologiser la filiation, la levée d'anonymat conforte juridiquement les places respectives de chacun dans l'AMP avec tiers d'honneur, en l'assumant comme un acte social digne et respectable qu'il n'y a pas à dénier ou à cacher. Le donneur ne peut prétendre à être le parent de l'enfant qu'il a aidé à engendrer, car cette place est réservée à ceux qui ont sollicité et reçu le don d'engendrement. La loi, donc, s'est dotée, la France efface le simulacre de filiation. Elle redéfinit la parentalité en acceptant qu'il y ait d'autres rôles que celui des parents, en acceptant qu'il y ait des coparents dont l'existence ne sera plus clandestine mais officielle. Il s'agissait donc d'un choix entre le maintien du simulacre assorti d'un mensonge ou le passage vers une réalité assumée et dite précocement à l'enfant, sans oublier que celui-ci peut tout entendre beaucoup plus facilement qu'il ne supporte les mensonges et les trahisons. Ma dernière plaque concerne le fait de défendre en conclusion avec ténacité tout ce qu'il y a d'humain dans l'homme, qui pourrait constituer une sorte de guide pour l'écriture d'une nouvelle morale laïque. Il y a des valeurs qui font consensus dans notre société. Non-exploitation des humains les uns par les autres, gratuité, égalité d'accès aux soins, droit de l'enfant à naître dans un milieu familial adapté avec des parents en âge de se reproduire, origine claire des gamètes si le mode de conception artificielle est connu de l'enfant. Il est possible que les valeurs essentielles auxquelles nous tenons tous collectivement puissent être bel et bien respectées dans ces nouvelles parentalités, à condition de les encadrer correctement. La naissance, si elle est un événement individuel, est en même temps un phénomène collectif, un événement pour l'espèce humaine, et cela reste une thématique politique à part entière. Notre vigilance doit nous permettre de rester dans des naissances d'enfants issus de l'enfantement et pas simplement d'une manipulation biologique procréative. Dans la fécondité, il y a des gamètes et des mots qui permettent de faire un enfant à partir du biologique, puis de le transcender pour que le bébé ne reste pas un enfant de la reproduction, mais devienne le fils ou la fille d'une lignée. De là, une seule question demeure pour l'ensemble des débats qui touchent à la procréation et que nous devons poursuivre. À quoi, tous ensemble, tenons-nous dans la construction du lien familial? C'est un magnifique travail à venir pour notre société, malgré le grand vertige qui nous saisit aujourd'hui. Voilà ce que je voulais dire sur le sujet, Maud.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, Professor Nisand, for your very inspiring introduction to this very complex question, where I'm fascinated by this, the way you have approached the potential of combining biological filiation with legal existence and how the two can coexist for children born through artificial reproductive technologies. And we are very grateful for offering such an interesting insight in this question, which will guide us in our further reflections, which will now be pursued by the introduction, which we are going to have by Professor Dr. Claire Achmad from Australia, so very late in the evening. But I think to hear from Professor Achmad what Article 8 of the Convention of the Rights of the Child has to say in respect of this matter would be extremely important. So, Claire, may I invite you to take the floor?
Merci beaucoup, Maud, and hello to everyone. Well, in simple terms, in answer to your question, Article 8 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child is relevant given that depending on how ART is practiced, it can place at risk the child's right to preserve their identity. However, all children in all circumstances have the right to identity preservation under Article 8, including those who are conceived and born through ART. So that was a brief introductory answer to your question, Maud, and I'm just going to now move through my short talk. So Article 8.1 of the CRC is the core of the right that we are talking about. And it says that states parties undertake to respect the right of the child to preserve his or her identity, including nationality, name, and family relations. I would like to highlight two key aspects of Article 8 in this respect. So first of all, to point out the use of this word preserve. Because of the significance of birth and early childhood to a person's ability to preserve their identity, and the fact that a child in these periods of their life has no agency to preserve their own identity, a child must rely on other people, namely adults, to do so. Secondly, in terms of the elements of identity, 3 elements are listed in the substantive right: nationality, name, and family relations. But this is not an exhaustive list, and this is because of the use of the word including before this list in Article 8.1. And in doing so, the drafters of the CRC are acknowledging that there are other elements of identity that exist. So we're not limited to these 3 elements. And we need to view the CRC as a living document, considering it in light of the present day situation. In an ART context, the elements of identity that can be particularly at risk for a child are those of genetic and biological elements of identity. These in turn can have an impact on the cultural and origin story aspects of a child's identity, as well as their rights to health under Article 23 and to the principles of the right to non-discrimination and the best interests of the child. Turning then to why the practice of ART relates to Article 8. A core reason is because of the more complex nature of how children are conceived through some ART practices, including, for example, as Professor Nisand touched on, the involvement of more than 2 people who can potentially be seen as parents to a child. Another reason is the decisions that are sometimes made through the practice of ART. Sometimes these decisions leave the child without the ability to fully experience their right to identity preservation. And it's important to note that the impact of the child's identity right can have an impact on outcomes throughout their life, therefore a lifetime impact. And this can also be intergenerational in effect. In terms of how the practice of ART relates to Article 8 of the CRC, this is because in some ART situations, children are unable to preserve specific elements of their identity. For example, this can be triggered through the use of anonymous donor gametes, meaning it's an impossibility for the child to know their genetic identity. In surrogacy, if an anonymous surrogate mother is involved, it means that it will be impossible for a child to know who the woman was who carried them to term and gave birth to them. And where the child's origin story is not preserved, it can mean that children don't have an understanding of their own circumstances of birth. When these practices that jeopardize Article 8 occur in ART, they usually happen as a result of decisions that are taken by people who are involved in ART arrangements. All of these situations that I've touched on likely lead to a lifetime impact on the child's rights and can't be undone or reversed once they are taken. I also want to emphasise here the interdependent and indivisible nature of children's rights and the kick-on effect that these kinds of decisions can have to, for example, the right to health and to cultural identity. I note also that even where elements of identity such as genetic and biological origins are preserved in ART, whether or not this information is shared with the child is another important related issue. Key lessons from donor conception, adoption, and domestic surrogacy show us that it's absolutely crucial that identity information is collected and preserved on behalf of children conceived and born through ART, including, for example, in international surrogacy. The body of evidence in this space also highlights that children born through ART need to be made aware of the existence of their identity information where it is preserved and must have the ability to access it. Without these things happening, the full nature of what Article 8 promises is undermined. So, given that the reality is that ART is a continuing practice, it's important that Article 8 is actively implemented in this context to ensure a protective approach for children. For example, many elements of a child's identity, including their genetic and biological identity, can begin to be preserved for a child prior to their birth through ART. For example, this can be done through deciding to only use known gamete donors who are willing to be contacted by any future child who's born, and in surrogacy, only involving surrogate mothers who are identifiable. If these steps are taken, they can act as protective factors for the child's right. Following a child's birth, the preservation of identity elements should also continue. So in short, where ART is practiced, it should occur in a way that places the protection of Article 8 at its heart. That is, ART should only occur when it's consistent with ensuring children born through ART are able to experience their right to identity preservation. I briefly want to touch on what's been happening in international, regional, and domestic law and practice, just briefly. I note that internationally, the Committee on the Rights of the Child since the mid-90s has issued a number of concluding observations that emphasise that information about a child's origins should be preserved in ART and should be able to be accessed by the child. Recently, the committee has endorsed the Verona Principles on the protection of the rights of the child born through surrogacy. And Principle 11 of the Verona Principles focuses on protecting identity and access to origins. It makes clear that states have a duty to ensure every child born through surrogacy has the opportunity to access information concerning their identity, including genetic, gestational, and social origins, and that where surrogacy is practiced, it should only occur where surrogate mothers and gamete donors are identifiable. The principle also makes clear that states have a particular role to play to support preserving the child's right to identity in surrogacy. I note that at the regional level as well, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and the European Court of Human Rights have both emphasised the importance of the child's right to identity and that it needs to be interpreted in light of the lifetime impact for a child or person. For example, in the European Court of Human Rights case of Odievre in France, the European Court of Human Rights said that obtaining information necessary to discover the truth concerning important aspects of one's personal identity, such as that of one's parents, birth, and in particular the circumstances in which a child is born, forms a part of a child's and subsequently an adult's right to private life as guaranteed under the European Convention on Human Rights. Domestically too, some jurisdictions have legislation in place that explicitly prohibits ART practices being undertaken when they are practiced anonymously, and expressly protects the child's right to obtain information about donor parents. An example of this is the Human Assisted Reproductive Technology Act from my country, New Zealand. In our country, we currently also have a review being undertaken of the law of surrogacy by our Law Commission. And one of the things that this is focusing on is prioritising the protection of the child's right to identity in surrogacy. So to conclude, I want to share with you 5 practical ideas for action to preserve the child's right under Article 8 in ART. First of all, decision-making. Adults who undertake ART should ideally take decisions that are consistent with and guided by Article 8. This will help to ensure that children born through ART have the opportunity to live lives that are built on an informed understanding of all the elements of their identity. Secondly, other actors in ART, especially lawyers and health professionals, have a key role to play in supporting the implementation of Article 8 in ART. Thirdly, domestic legislation should explicitly uphold and protect Article 8 in ART. And fourth, in surrogacy, states are encouraged to implement the guidance that's outlined in the Verona Principles to uphold Article 8 of the CRC in surrogacy situations. And fifth and finally, in short, all states and all people involved in ART should proactively implement Article 8 in ART situations for all children, always holding central the lifetime impact that the preservation of identity information has for a child. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire, for your very powerful presentation on the importance of Article 8 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and especially for your last remarks, which contain really very practical recommendations for all stakeholders, not only states, but also individuals who are in one way or another confronted with this decision-making process to resort to ART. And thank you, Mia, for having just quickly typed in the recommendations, because they are really very important because we want to go really beyond theory. We want really to see how we can really meet the needs and the rights of children born through these techniques. So thank you very much, Claire. We may come back to you later on with further questions, but for the time being, I would like to move on, and I think we are just in time according to our schedule. So I would like to give the floor now to our next speaker, who is Professor Olga Khazova, who is a former CRC committee member. And she will explore with us the committee's jurisprudence, of which we have heard already a little bit from Claire. We would like to hear her because she has contributed very strongly herself, obviously, to these decisions as a member of the CRC. And perhaps you could also elaborate a little bit on what the potential of the third optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child in this respect. So Professor Khazova, dear Olga, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Maud. Good afternoon, and I'm really very happy to be with you, although virtually, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'm just trying to share my small PowerPoint. Yes, here it is. Claire has so brilliantly explained everything about Article 8, but I will not go that much into the detail and just try to give you an overall picture of what is committee's position on these matters. So the CRC committee has always paid special attention to the child's right to know as far as possible his or her parents and the right to identity enshrined in Article 7 and 8 of the Convention. However, initially the committee did not specifically focus that much on identity issue in the context of assisted reproduction, although this is the area where identity-related issues most obviously intersect. As noted by Professor Geraldine van Buren in one of her recent publications, this right was not universally welcomed at the time the convention was adopted. To illustrate, she refers to, you may see the text of the declaration at the screen. To illustrate, she particularly referred to the fact that Czechoslovakia, as it then was, ratified the CRC with the declaration in respect of Article 7, paragraph 1, that in case of artificial fertilization, the non-communication of natural parents' names to the child is not in contradiction with this provision. Perhaps the concluding observations addressed to Norway as early as 1994 was an exception and may serve as the very first example when the committee raised concerns in this regard. The committee noted in these concluding observations that the possible contradiction between the right of a child to know his or her origins with the Norwegian policy, I quote, in relation to artificial insemination, namely in keeping the identity of sperm donors secret. Only relatively recently, the committee started to address different AIT-related aspects, including right to identity, on a more systematic basis and in a more constructive manner. Thus, the committee's position on access to information on identity was expressed in the concluding observations addressed to the United Kingdom, Israel, Ireland, Georgia, Spain, Belgium, Australia, Malta, and finally Luxembourg in June 2021, this summer. Although AIT-related matters are often dealt with under different chapeaux in the committee's concluding observations, and the committee's position therefore may look fragmentary, it is overall clear and absolutely straightforward, at least with regard to the child's right to identity. The wording may be different, but the idea is the same. The states, in accordance with Article 7 and 8, should ensure that children born through assisted reproduction technologies, including with the involvement of surrogates, have access to information about their origin. As the most recent example, in the concluding observations addressed to Luxembourg this year, the committee also expressed concerns that the provisions on donor conception in a draft law that was under discussion in the state party were very vague, and that it was unclear which service would be responsible for managing and storing the data that would subsequently allow a child a right of access to this data concerning his or her origin. Another example of the importance of the wording. Back in 2002, in a dialogue with Switzerland, the committee's objection was to the wording of the law on medically assisted procreation, that a child could be informed on the identity of his or her father only if he or she had a legitimate interest. A question: doesn't a child born with the use of assisted reproduction technology by definition always have or should have a legitimate interest in knowing the truth about his or her origin? Regrettably, the wording has not been changed since then. And now, as to the third optional protocol, and I will try to answer your question, Maud. Firstly, the third optional protocol on children communication, or OPIC as we call it for brief, was adopted in 2011, and sorry, I need to shift to another slide, yes, and came into force in 2014. Since then, it has received 48 ratifications, not that many. If the committee finds a violation of the child's right in a particular case, the views adopted by the committee on that case usually represent, taking into account the context and the circumstances, a twofold remedy. First, an individual remedy with regard to a particular applicant or author, and second, a remedy of a more general nature, a kind of systemic solution that aims to prevent similar violations in the future. Among the wide variety of cases that the committee has considered, there was so far just only one related to assisted reproduction, surrogacy specifically. The issue was about registration. Here it is, the case you may see at the screen. The issue was about registration of a surname of two children born by a surrogate. This communication was ruled by the committee manifestly ill-founded, particularly because the author or the father had not presented convincing arguments that his twin sons were victims of a violation of Article 8 of the Convention. The facts, very briefly. The author of a communication resides in Costa Rica. His two sons were born in the United States and California by a surrogate by means of in vitro fertilization using donor's egg and author's gametes. The Californian court declared the author to be the sole legal parent and denied legal parenthood to the surrogate in accordance with their surrogacy agreement. Interestingly, in the boy's US birth certificate, their surname consisted of two surnames. One of their father's first surname and second of the egg donor's maiden name. In accordance with the egg donation agreement, the identity of the egg donor was confidential. Nevertheless, the egg donor had agreed to disclose her identity and to allow the boys, when they reached the age of 18, contact her if they so wished. However, Costa Rican authorities refused to recognize the children's surnames as they were indicated in American documents because to put aside all the details, because it contradicted mandatory legal rules of Costa Rica. As the result, no information about the egg donor was reflected in birth registry, and the children's official Costa Rican documents. The father argued that this was a violation of his son's right to preserve his identity under Article 8 of the Convention, because by bearing the name of the egg donor, or in other words, as the father argued, of their biological mother, I would say genetic mother, the boys would be able to preserve their true birth identity and to maintain a permanent natural link to it. This case, although declared inadmissible, seems to be very educative and provides food for thought. It would be interesting to know what you think about it. And as to, very briefly, as to Maud's question, I believe that optional protocol on child communication will become increasingly important way of providing a child with effective remedy in cases of violation of his or her rights generally and the right to identity specifically. In my opinion, the potential of OPIC is huge. We just need more states to ratify it. And perhaps one of our tasks is to somehow push the states to join the optional protocol. I stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Olga, for this fascinating presentation of how the Committee of the Rights of the Child went about these issues under different headings, but still with a very clear message that the access to information about the origin is absolutely crucial and should be guaranteed in all circumstances. And I also thank you for your very optimistic note on the potential of OPIC. I think if we can draw a parallel with what the right of individual petition looked like in Europe in the very beginning of the year, when the European Commission of Human Rights was operating under the Convention on the European Convention on Human Rights, and what it has become now with the court as a single judicial body dealing with individual cases. I think perhaps indeed, as time goes by and as we receive more ratification, this is a great potential and provides a remedy for children also about this very important children's human rights. So thank you for having informed us of your views on this. And I would like to move on now to the next speaker in this morning's session, who is Tanja Kleinzorge. In her capacity as head of the Secretariat of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe's Committee on Social Affairs, Health and Sustainable Development, can enlighten us, I'm sure, about the genesis and the background and perhaps the meaning and the significance of a text which was adopted by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe in 2019, which Tanja will explain, which relates to the anonymous donation of sperm and oocytes. Tanja, if you're with us, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's always a pleasure to speak to this group of people, and especially under the supervision of Maud, who used to be our Deputy Secretary General in the Council of Europe. So the Council of Europe is an organization of 47 member states, all of them in Europe, as the name suggests, so just in case people don't know it that well. It's most well known, of course, the European Court of Human Rights, but it does have a parliamentary assembly, and this parliamentary assembly includes delegations from the 47 national parliaments. So they're not directly elected like in the European Parliament, but they're rather sent from the national parliaments. And the Parliamentary Assembly is a bit of a motor for the Council of Europe. So it kind of is, it's rather progressive on many issues, and it often takes the Committee of Ministers a while to catch up, because the Committee of Ministers, especially on more divisive subjects, does still try to seek some kind of consensus, and everything takes a long time. So the Committee of Ministers actually started looking at this question of the donation of sperm and oocytes, and what would be the rights and the legal status of children and the parental responsibilities, including in this whole question of donation, already in 2012. But they couldn't agree on anything. So what they did is they postponed the discussion sine die. So they've never really taken it up again. We then had an attempt in the Parliamentary Assembly to look at children's rights related to surrogacy, where in the end there was no text adopted, although there was a debate in 2015 in the Parliamentary Assembly. So the Parliamentary Assembly decided that at that point, perhaps we can at least look at the question of donation before we go to surrogacy again. So we started looking at this question of anonymous donation of sperms and oocytes and balancing the rights of parents, donors, and children when it comes to this issue. And for the Parliamentary Assembly, what was really important looking at this was to see that you have the UN CRC, which Claire has well explained the theory and Olga has well explained the practice. But this is a standalone right, yes, but it's a standalone right of children. So if you are no longer a child, you can't actually, benefit from the rights of the CRC. But what if you have never even actually, you only find out when you are older that you are donor created. So that's where, of course, the European Convention of Human Rights has come in, and this applies also to adults, not just to children. And the European Court of Human Rights has recognized the right to access of origins and to develop an identity as an integral part of the right to respect for private life. However, this is not an absolute right. It always needs to be balanced with other rights. And the rights of donors, obviously, of parents. And I would say also the question of, there are some, perhaps not rights, but there are also legitimate interests of third actors, of other stakeholders, be it in clinics, be it the state itself. The state has an interest, of course, to have an illegitimate interest, to have the rule of law. So filiation must be clear, for example. So what has happened really, I think, over the years is that the situation has been so different in the different member states that the court has given member states a very, very large margin of appreciation. And this is where usually what happens is that because the old model where it came from, because a lot of this anonymous donation models, this is legislation derived from laws in the organ donation or in the adoption areas, which have just been kind of repurposed. And so this was always putting a lot more emphasis on the rights of the donors, their right to privacy, not to be contacted, etc., not to be known, and also perhaps possibly sometimes misconceived right of parents to have kind of a peaceful filiation of family life. And the rights of children were often, or the rights of donor-assisted born persons were just not considered to be as important. And I think this is something which is starting to change. So the Parliamentary Assembly said, this the balancing of different rights, interests, and obligations has until recently often tended to favor the donor's right to privacy and therefore donor anonymity. But this is moving. And the Parliamentary Assembly considered that the distinguishing features of the Council of Europe, namely its mandate to promote human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, and its role of fostering good practice among the member states, places the organization in an ideal position to address the risks and challenges related to the anonymity of sperm and oocyte donations. And so the Parliamentary Assembly is saying we need to look at everybody's rights and everybody's interests, legitimate interests only, of course. And then we have to focus on the rights of the donor-conceived person because that person is in the most vulnerable position, and for them the stakes are much higher than for anyone else. So the Assembly wasn't quite sure whether this should be in the end legally binding, yes or no. But they made several suggestions. They first of all suggested that anonymity should be waived for all future gamete donations in Council of Europe member states, and the use of anonymously donated sperm and oocytes should be prohibited. The waiving of anonymity should have no legal consequences for filiation, so you still have, the rule of law and everything is clear. Council of Europe member states which permit sperm or oocyte donations should set up and run a national donor and donor-conceived person register with a view to facilitating the sharing of information, with a view to enforcing also an upper limit on the number of possible donations by the same donor, ensuring that close relations cannot marry, and tracing donors if the medical need should arise. Finally, there was also an emphasis on that, and sorry, one more. The anonymity of gamete donors should not be lifted retroactively, where anonymity was promised at the time of the donation, except for medical reasons or where the donor has consented to the lifting of the anonymity, and thus inclusion on the donor and donor conceived person register. And these principles should all be applied without prejudice to the overriding consideration that gamete donation should remain a voluntary and altruistic gesture with the sole aim of helping others, and should thus not lead to any financial gain or comparable advantage to the donor. So this was pretty groundbreaking, pretty progressive. And of course, the Committee of Ministers did reply after 6 months to this recommendation, and basically said, yeah, this is really, really interesting. And we agree with lots of the things that you said, but we also see lots of problems. Always the question, of course, arises of respect for people's privacy when it comes to the question of establishing donor registries or donor-conceived people registries, because the donor-conceived children, of course, will never have actually consented to being included in this registry. So you have kind of legal problems stacking up on this kind of question. Then there's the question of what's the actual impact going to be, and unfortunately, the Committee of Ministers was also a little bit, I think they believed a myth which has been debunked several times already, that there might be less donations if you have to be included in donor registries and things like that. And this is actually not true. Actually, what one has seen in those countries where donor anonymity has been waived is that you have a different class of donor. You have people who are slightly older. You don't have the college students so much anymore who do it for a quick buck. So it's more, it's actually probably a good thing. You'll get better, in inverted commas, donors who are doing it for the right reasons rather than for the wrong reasons. So all is not lost. The Committee of Ministers did decide that their Legal Affairs Committee, Steering Committee, should, in consultation with different other committees, consider in its future activities the feasibility and desirability of preparing a draft recommendation or other non-binding instrument to assist member states in protecting the rights of donor-conceived persons to know their origins, whilst ensuring a balance with the interests and rights of other parties involved in sperm and oocyte donation, and of the interests of society and obligations of the state. So we'll see how long this takes, but at least, we've started the work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tanya, for having informed us about the difficulties which the Parliamentary Assembly was facing itself to come to an agreement on this very difficult issue, and especially when it comes obviously about finding the right balance between privacy rights and other rights of children. The privacy issue is nowadays is very much sometimes a sort of hindering argument in making progress in terms of protecting children. But I think the text you described, I think, is promising, and perhaps we will see later at a later stage, not too far away from now, a text on surrogacy. Why not? Thank you very much. I think we have come to the end of this morning's presentations, but obviously there are lots of questions which have arisen. There has been extensive exchanges in the chat box, to which some of the speakers have answered. But I think that it is important to try to get some clarity in what states should prioritize in order to uphold the rights of children in relation to identity in ART. And I wonder whether I could ask you, speakers, who would like to give us an idea on how they see the priorities in this respect, in terms of regulation, or what needs to be done to get this right. Is anyone wish to comment on this? I think it is important to ask for the floor, and when you have asked for the floor, you will get the floor. But just speak like that is not very useful. So Catherine has asked for the floor. So can you formulate your question, and a question, please, not just comments.
It was just an observation, not a question. That of the way to approach it is, of course, the primacy of the child's interest. I know there's a lot of interests that we're balancing and thinking about, but in the end, I mean, in a humane society, really, every adult must put their own desires and needs aside to make the child's rights primary if they're in conflict. That was just a general comment.
Anyway, you will have an opportunity tomorrow to expand on this question in the context, in particular context of surrogacy. Does anyone else amongst the panelists wish to give an indication of what they feel should be prioritized in addressing these issues? Claire.
Maybe I could just
hear you. Mia, can you clear the floor? Can you unmute yourself, Claire?
Yes. I'm just asking Mia, are you able to mute your microphone?
It's not my microphone, it's Wen Chai.
Okay.
Wen Chai, can you mute your microphone? And yeah, perfect.
Thank you. So just in response to your question, Maud, I think the key thing from my perspective is that individual states really can make a choice now, and need to make a choice in terms of how they choose to use their domestic regulatory system and domestic legislation to actually give effect to the right under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, under Article 8, to protect the child's right to identity. And I think, as a number of people in the chat box have been discussing during this session, and as I picked up on through my presentation, this right isn't just about what happens for a person when they're a child. It is a right that has an ongoing impact throughout a person's life, and indeed has wide-ranging, multifaceted impacts on a person's life. And so states can actually make a choice to take protective action through their domestic legislation to uphold the child's right and the person's right to identity throughout their lifetime. And actually expressly legislating that into domestic law is a very important step that, in my view, needs to be taken by many more states around the world, especially given that ART is a practice that is continuing to evolve. We only have to look at the advent of international commercial surrogacy over the past decade, and the development of the market that has really grown in response to demand for children through surrogacy. So this is an important step that can be taken, and in the meantime, if states are choosing not to legislate, then they really need to implement the CRC. They have all states in the world, apart from the United States, have duties and obligations under the CRC, and this includes for children and people who are born through ART of all forms. And the Verona Principles make very clear where surrogacy, for example, occurs, there are a range of children's rights, including the right to identity, that must be upheld and protected.
Thank you, Claire. Oh, yes, Olga. Can you unmute yourself?
Sorry, thank you, Maud. Just few different ideas that occurred to my mind while listening presentations and reading the discussion at the chat box. First of all, as Claire, I will not repeat. She brilliantly explained the importance of knowing one's origin. It's really a lifelong feeling, and it is absolutely crucial, important. We know from adoption, which has very long story, that adopted children who in the age when adoption was secret, how they were deeply traumatized. This is really trauma for the whole their life, and already being adult or often pretty old people, they still feel that this was the main pain which they have to struggle with during their whole life, not knowing the origin. As to how there was a question and some discussion that if the child knows one's origin, child conceived through assisted reproduction knows one origin, how it coincides with keeping family together. We know from practice that it doesn't destroy the family's unity. It has nothing to do with that. If it has been done in a delicate and sufficiently early stage but the point is that it is almost impossible to keep the secret. Earlier or later, a child will know the truth, and this would be for sure huge trauma for the child, for the adoptive parents or intending parents, and this could really destroy the family unity completely, because this would mean, and the child will immediately understand, that the parents were lying. And this is unforgettable. This is really trauma. But at the same time, I need to, of course, we all understand that it's better. It would be better if surrogate motherhood never existed, but it so happened that it's already advances of medical science. And let's not forget that it was invented to treat fertility problems for many couples. But the problem is that assisted reproduction created so many legal, ethical problems which the society never faced before, and we keep struggling. I mean, all those who are in this or that way involved in these issues, we keep struggling on how to better regulate it. But it's obviously clear that the only way to tackle the problems that arise in this regard is to regulate. Because as we know, children are already here and need to be, they have been already born, and they need to be, their status need to be clarified. They should have birth certificates and so on and so forth. But what is true that these issues, especially with regard to children, they are so sensitive, so ethically and legally controversial. So they really require very thorough thinking and very cautious decision-making. But among all the issues that arise in regard with AIT, probably the child's right to know his or her origin is the most obvious and undisputable. Final point, one literally half a minute. 30 seconds.
We need to give the floor to a few other speakers. So if you can round up.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. No, I would like to also address Professor Nisand. He has witnessed the coming into being of legislation in France recently concerning this the anonymous donation of gametes, and there has been a clear evolution. I would like to ask him whether this is what he believes the right answer to protect children from a bioethic perspective.
Oui, je crois que la loi est la seule possibilité pour faire avancer, car sans cela, il y aura toujours un cas particulier, une situation particulière, où on aura envie de faire plaisir à des parents, où des parents auront l'argent qu'il faut pour obtenir des équipes médicales ce qu'ils veulent. Or, je pense que la loi est le seul outil pour protéger correctement les enfants contre des dérapages qui peuvent se produire. La loi de la France était très restrictive en termes d'anonymat, car elle avait été écrite en 70, à un moment où quand un homme était stérile, il fallait surtout pas que ça se sache, parce qu'il y avait une confusion entre stérilité et virilité. Et donc, les parents rentraient dans un service d'aide médicale à la procréation à 2 et ils sortaient à 3, ni vus ni connus. C'est-à-dire que c'était hocus pocus, il n'y avait pas d'enfant, et maintenant il y a un enfant, et il vient du papa, et on fait comme s'il venait du papa, on choisissait même les gamètes du donneur pour que personne ne puisse se rendre compte, y compris à la lecture du groupe sanguin, que cet enfant ne pouvait pas être de ce père-là. Ça, c'est terminé. Plus personne n'est aujourd'hui dans la position des années 70. On est aujourd'hui dans un monde où on se préoccupe de la santé de l'enfant. Et puis, il y a des enfants de 40 ans qui nous disent que cette méthode-là ne va pas, que ça leur pose problème de ne pas avoir une vue complète de leur histoire et de leur biographie. Ces enfants ont fait bouger la loi. Ils ont fait bouger la loi de telle manière qu'aujourd'hui, à l'avenir, les donneurs ne pourront plus être anonymes. Ils devront s'engager à donner des données identifiantes pour que 18 ans plus tard, les enfants puissent demander à les rencontrer s'ils le souhaitent. Ce n'est pas une obligation. Il y a déjà de nombreux pays d'Europe qui le font et la France a enfin, je dirais enfin, réussi à faire taire toutes les oppositions qui voulaient maintenir le vieux système patriarcal où le père ne peut pas être stérile, c'est forcément le père, et s'il y a une intervention des médecins, c'est comme si elle n'avait pas eu lieu. Donc, pour moi, la situation qui vient de se produire là et qui va s'appliquer maintenant en France est une situation normale qui ne cherche pas un enfant à tout prix, coûte que coûte, mais cherche à faire en sorte que les enfants puissent se retourner sur le passé et savoir ce qui leur est arrivé. Pour conclure, j'aurais tendance, Maud, à dire on a le droit de tout faire pour qu'un enfant vienne au monde. On n'a pas le droit de lui cacher ce qu'on a fait pour se faire.
Thank you very much, Israel. I'm not sure that everybody could follow your intervention. I have taken some notes.
I'm not so good in English.
No, but I have.
I am afraid that it will not be good.
No, I just wanted perhaps to summarize with all my limitations. What you said, you just said that the law, that the answer which France has given, which is to change the law, is what is needed. These matters should not be decided on a case-to-case basis to protect children against abusive situations. You described the French situation in the 1970s, where there was a confusion between the concept of sterility and fertility, and everything was done in great secrecy. That has now changed in France. The primary concern is the health of the child. And if this change has been able to come about in France, it's because there are 40 years of history of children who have been born under that scheme, and it's they who have made this law change. There's no longer anonymity. Children can, when the law enters into force, as from the age of 18, if they so wish, seek to know who are their origins, which is such an important matter for them. The situation which has arisen as a result of this law is the normal situation in your view, and you ended with a very good sentence which I didn't note down, but can you repeat it, please?
Yes, you can do anything to have a new baby because there is nothing more beautiful, but you have not to to hide what you did for this life.
Thank you very much. I think that is a very good way of ending our morning session, because we have reached the time now for our coffee break, lunch break, whatever. Enjoy it, and we will meet again at 14:45 Central European time. And I hope that our Australian and New Zealand friends will still be with us. Otherwise, we will meet tomorrow, definitely. But this afternoon, we would like to start at 14:45 Central European time sharp. So see you later. Have a nice lunch break or whatever. Bye-bye.
Okay.